Boardroom Bound, episode 168, Cybersecurity and the Greatest Vulnerabilities in the Boardroom, with Andrzej Cetnarski.
I generally say that board directors are indeed the number one incubus of cyber insecurity for companies. Let that sink in. As many years I have been in the cybersecurity space, that is unfortunately the number one risk from a human being perspective because, as you've already said, Alexander, board directors have access to the most sensitive data.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's episode, we're speaking with Andrzej Cetnarski, and he is a cyber expert, as you will very quickly learn today. And he's going to help us understand whether we've done nothing or a little bit. None of us have done as much as we should have. An easy way to think about this, he's going to talk about breach prevention, incident response, as well as investment capital into cyber technologies. There is so much all of us need to know and understand, and he does it in a way that doesn't make our heads spin. Let's get into some learning for today. Before we jump into today's show, I'd like to share a message from our sponsor about director certification. Want to join your first board, or are you looking for additional board seat opportunities? In either scenario, be sure to be disciplined in your approach. Now, through the Becoming an Exceptional Board Director Candidate Coaching and Certification course, you get both modern board director candidate packaging and modern board operations knowledge integrated within one program. Remember, the key to landing additional or your first board seat is in your packaging. Make the effort to do it right. Program graduates also receive their globally recognized International Board Director Competency Designation upon course completion. It's designed for individuals and groups. You can learn more at bit.ly/IBDC-D. That's bit.ly, bit.ly/IBCDC-D. And now let's jump into the show. Andrzej Cetnarski, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
It's wonderful to be on, Alexander, and great to be with everybody.
Well, and for me, this is always fun when I can bring a fellow Wharton person into the show. We have our biases, but you check the Harvard Business School box as well, so I guess you got them all covered. So before we start diving into
Harvard
all the...
Kennedy School.
True. We'll say Harvard, yeah.
to be there, given my Wharton MBA background.
And you check two Wharton boxes, right? Because you got the Lauder Institute under UPenn and Wharton, so it's all good. Plus you got Chicago undergrad, so you got all the degrees covered that we need. And then we're going to talk about how all that background experience comes together for you to be this person of incredible reputation in the cyberspace. And we're all going to learn so much today because there's so much more we need to learn. But before I jump into that, let's start with your background overview and how you got to this position that you're in today.
Yeah, I always say I have sort of come from three different backgrounds. I started out as a congressional staffer to Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney out of New York, which really got me excited and interested in government in the early days. But then I morphed very quickly into the private sector, starting out my career as a young investment banker with Mitsubishi UFJ Morgan Stanley out of Tokyo, and then HSBC, and then UBS on the tech, defense, aerospace and defense, and real estate side. And I therefore always say, yes, I've got the government background that's sort of been there constantly throughout my life. And then I have this advisory background of working with large boards, multi-billion-dollar deals all over the globe, et cetera, as an advisor to these companies. And then I have the third one, which is an entrepreneur in the tech and cybersecurity space for now nearly a decade. So that said, though, cybersecurity for me has been a dual entry. One is when I was that younger investment banker at UBS working on aerospace and defense companies, which at the time in the 2008, 2009 era were sort of the guys that focused on cybersecurity. The Palo Alto networks, the FireEyes of the world didn't really exist in the form that they do today. And so that was my first foray into cybersecurity. But I wish that was the actual foray. My actual foray is because a company that I founded and was chairman and CEO of got breached, and $25 million of value created went down the drain because despite following every single one of the rules in the book on what a cybersecurity organization at that point was, this is now years and years ago, we still were breached despite having a very highfalutin board, very experienced board, same with the executive team. And so I said, well, wait a minute. If this can happen to us, and mind you, this is before Hillary Clinton, emails got breached and servers got breached, and therefore before really the world woke up to this issue of, oh my God, we are cyber insecure left and right. And so at the time already I said, well, if a board like ours and if an executive team like ours can get breached, then what does an average, even Fortune 500 company, much less an SMB, stand to lose and stand to gain if it's handled appropriately? And so I decided to throw the weight of my background, my educational background, as you've mentioned, as well as the investment banking, entrepreneurial, and government background, and really go full throttle on this. And since creating, indeed, a cyber defense ecosystem called Cyber Nation Central, bringing to private and government sector leaders both breach prevention and breach response capability, alongside with a couple of other things. But that's generally how I got into this space, really.
And we should put a little context around that. I'll give two quick examples. When I think back to my time at JP Morgan, you're talking about one of the most important financial institutions in the world, and they are getting poked and prodded and hopefully not breached on a daily basis, to the point where they spend $250 million a year on their defenses, and they built state-of-the-art 3 centers to follow the sun around the world from, let's see, it was Hong Kong to London to New York, and they are still always trying to stay ahead of what is a tough game. And the other example I think of, when I think back to Stratfor, and this was basically like a private CIA, and they were one of the leading companies around the world in geopolitical analysis and intelligence, and they got probed and they got hacked back in like 2011, 2012, and you're thinking, this is a company who's clearly paying attention to this stuff as well. So it happens, right? So clearly we want to learn from these things, and you're going to drop a lot of that knowledge today, because no matter what organization anyone listening to this is in, no matter whether it's public or private or nonprofit, etc., we all need to be careful, because someone has trusted us with data, and we've got a lot of stuff that we want to make sure doesn't get on the front page of the newspaper. So I'm glad that you're going to be able to break this down and explain this to us today. And maybe a good starting point is, there's probably different aspects of this that many of us don't think about. And if you could just sort of explain it, we probably think about, say, breach prevention, and maybe that's part of it, right? But once you get breached, maybe there's sort of the incident response that happens, and then maybe there's sort of investment for the longer term into cyber technologies to try to avoid all of this when you think about the future changing. Is that a good way to think about that, sort of the 3 parts?
Yeah, it is. And if you talk to any national security expert, especially on the crisis management side, they're going to give you the formula of pre-boom, boom, and post-boom, right? What do you do in terms of prevention, in terms of as you're going through the breach, if you know it, and then what do you do thereafter to learn from it and respond to it? So that's definitely one way of thinking about it. The other way of thinking about it is, and you've already highlighted it a little bit with, even JP Morgan has this issue, it really is an issue that touches everybody. It doesn't matter whether you are a major investment bank that has billions of dollars behind cybersecurity or a startup. I very often get asked, well, wait a minute, who would want to go after a startup? And the unfortunate part is that if you are doing anything that is of interest to anyone, especially if it's intellectual property or a hot new product on the market, whatever it is, someone is interested in you. So then the question becomes, well, when is that interest going to really catch up to me? And that gets you into another topic. But before I get into that topic, perhaps one thing to also bear in mind is the statistics. More than 50% of breaches actually happen against small and medium enterprises. Now, what is an SMB, right? If you actually listen to JP Morgan statistics, 99% of American enterprises are SMBs, right? With employees less than 1,000, or rather revenue less than a billion, employees less than 500, so on and so forth. So you really are vulnerable whether you're a startup or a corporation. The other side of it is this is not a technology problem, as much as people give it due attention. Why? When you look at current breaches, 97 or 96, 95, depending on the statistics you're listening to, but let's say 95 to 97% of cyber breaches are caused by cyber insecure behaviors, social engineering, etc., not technologies. And so I recently spoke, in fact, I led a panel on the International Cyber Innovation Summit, where I brought the head of AI for JP Morgan, the head of AI for the Department of Defense, and the head of cybersecurity policy for the Israeli National Cyber Directorate. And my friend from the INCD from Israel challenged me and said, well, Andrzej, that means that we're doing something great with technology, right? I mean, 3%, right, is caused by technology. And I said, yes, but here's the problem. Cybercrime is currently a $6 trillion economy. It's being projected to rise to $10.5 trillion by 2025. If you then look at, if that's the problem, well, what's the solution? Well, the solution market, right, the cybersecurity solutions market is worth about $182 billion right now. Excuse me? So that means we have a current $5.8 trillion gap between what cybercrime is and what the solutions market is. And so if any board tells anybody that they are cyber ready, I would very quickly short that stock.
Well, you didn't have to go to the world's leading business school to realize there's a delta there, right?
That's right. But what's interesting is, most boards don't necessarily internalize, even if they're super smart, how big this problem is becoming. Why? The easiest way to think about it if you're a board director is, well, where does cybercrime come from? Cybercrime comes from the fact that we've got a physical world that we are digitalizing very rapidly. And so even though the physical into digital is not a one-to-one relationship, right? Not everything physical is getting its digital avatar, but whatever you do make digital, you have to cyber secure on a one-to-one relationship. If you don't, you're literally leaving a gap for hackers. So on the one hand, you've got a fast digitalizing economy, fast digitalizing world. And by world, I mean 4 different areas. I don't care whether it's the individual, whether it's a building, whether it's an institution, or whether it's a country. All 4, right, individual, institution, building, company, or government, and country, all 4 have a digital replica of itself right now. Think about that for a second. And so if you're digitalizing yourself as an individual, right now it's your iPhone or it's your laptop or it's whatever. 10 years from now, it's going to be your iris, right? Your eye talking to your ophthalmologist, etc., or your pacemaker or whatever. And so as you're digitalizing each of those pieces of the infrastructure, the self, the building, the institution, the country, you have to start thinking about this idea of what makes a cyber sovereign fill in the blank nation, building, right, with its own replica in cyberspace. How do we secure that? And so hackers are seeing that. Hackers are seeing the fact that we have a digital, let's say, United States, which if you hearkened it back to, what did the physical real estate of the United States look like circa 1800? Well, that's kind of where we currently are in cyberspace, right? In cyberspace, our world looks like America circa 1800 in terms of its infrastructure development. So when you know that we have so much development, so much building ahead of us in the digital stratosphere. But therefore, because most companies are not plowing enough capital into cyber securing everything on a one-to-one relationship, that delta continues to grow. And that's the reason why currently a manager in the hacking world, and everybody on this call should be aware of the fact that now there are professionally organized hacking companies. This is no longer a garage kind of an effort. And so when you look at a manager in the hacking industry, they can make $2 million a year. A typical hacker, $20,000, $30,000 a job. And so therefore, the number of hackers getting into this industry is growing. The opportunity or the threat landscape is growing because digitalization is growing. And so that delta becomes bigger and bigger, which is why you're talking about a $10.5 trillion economy, cybercrime economy in 2025 vis-a-vis the current $6.5 trillion, which already is the third largest economy in the world after US and China. That's another way of looking at it and thinking about it.
And I think you probably blew a lot of minds there. So let me just try to put a little context around it. So I'm guessing when people look around, like, say, what's happening in the world right now between Russia and Ukraine, people can imagine, like, maybe there's cells in Russia that are the world's elite hackers and whatever they're doing to bring down, say, potentially the Ukrainian government. We can picture that. Maybe in the other extreme, we picture, if we go back to, like, back in time to, like, there's that early 80s movie with Matthew Broderick called War Games, where this high school kid who's a computer genius basically accidentally hacks into a military supercomputer while searching for new video games, and he starts global nuclear war on the game, right? So we can probably picture those, and everything in between is what you're saying. And clearly those are all sort of scary prospects of whether someone comes in just by accident or comes in intentionally, like you're a target. And I imagine most of us listening to this are thinking, okay, we can figure out that probably the main problem are the human beings. Like, this is where we are. But I don't think board members probably think of themselves as the problem as the human being. They probably think about the employees or the customers. But I'd love your thoughts on this, because board members have access to a lot of sensitive data about the company, and maybe they're not using the best behaviors and practices. How should we as board members be certainly example number one for our customers and our employees and everyone else?
What a great question. I generally say that board directors are indeed the number one incubus of cyber insecurity for companies. Let that sink in. As many years I have been in the cybersecurity space, that is unfortunately the number one risk from a human being perspective, because, as you've already said, Alexander, board directors have access to the most sensitive data. However, note that generally no director on a board is subject to even the, let's say, middle of the road quality cybersecurity policies of a company, much less high quality policies of the company. But let's say you have a company that is superb in cybersecurity policy. The likelihood that that board director in that company is actually held to the standards of those policies isn't particularly high, right? Why? Because as a board director, you're generally an external person, right? Unless you're an executive director and you're coming from the company internally, and therefore you are subject to those policies. But think about it. Many board directors communicate with the company via whatever it is, Gmail, their own personal Outlook account, or whatever it is. And most likely they are very often not coming from a highfalutin cybersecurity company in which they themselves would be subject to very strict cybersecurity policies around their own digital infrastructure. And so you've got two issues that a typical board director brings to their company, the one that they're on the board of. One is the cyber insecurity of the technologies that they use in order to access the networks of the company. The second one is the behavioral component. And as we mentioned at the beginning of this call, up to 97% of cybersecurity breaches are because of cyber insecure behaviors. So then you have to overlay this data with the fact that board directors are generally non-technical, right? You could have a very technical CISO background kind of a board director, but for the most part, directors are not necessarily, right? You've got HR committees, you've got audit committees, whatever they are, they're not necessarily a technical board director. And so right off the bat, they don't necessarily bring the most cybersecure technologies to begin with, on top of which they're busy, right? They don't necessarily keep up with cybersecurity trends. And so in the busyness of it all and in the usual non-technical nature of it all of a board member, you're exacerbating the issue even further. And so hackers, knowing that, are all of a sudden now paying attention increasingly more to cyber whaling, which is simply going after those individuals within the company or on a board that indeed have access to those sensitive pieces of information because they're easiest to hack. And in fact, Forbes formally came out with an assessment in which they said the easiest target is often that high net worth individual and board director because their every voice, tone, right? Scripted note, whatever exists in the stratosphere for hackers to comb through. If you've got any voice imprint on your website, or if you've got information about you everywhere because you're a prolific person, it's very easy to study you. It's very easy to study your behaviors and then impersonate you where that is possible. That issue of cyber whaling is becoming a serious issue for companies in a number of ways, but we can get to that later in the call.
So this is fascinating. So let's give a couple quick takeaways for our audience listening to this who are, let's say they're board members or maybe they're C-suite members wanting to be board members, but they have board members, they're worried about them, like things that people should do immediately. It sounds like, based on what you're saying, probably low-hanging fruit in some ways. But for example, would you be advocating that board members are no longer allowed to use external email for their communications? They have to be put on the firm's email so that at least they're inside the firewall? Is that sort of one way we're talking about?
Absolutely, but that's super low-hanging fruit. What we generally say is the following. Culture of cybersecurity does not come from the CISO. It does not come from the CEO. It comes from the board of directors. If the board of directors is not managing their oversight of the company through a cyber avatar fiduciary responsibilities of their own, then they are currently not living up to their cybersecurity fiduciary duties. And the unfortunate result of that is that because governments, especially the U.S. government, but even Germany, UK, others, are now starting to crack down very hard on not just boards, but individual board directors that can be perceived to have negligently behaved around the issue of cybersecurity oversight of the company that they are on the board of. So it is no longer as simple as you need to make sure that you are within the firewall of your organization. No, it gets jettisoned all the way to the stratosphere of culture starts from the top, and it's not just from the CEO, because the CEO, to a certain degree, also follows the direction of the board and may very well, and we've seen it too often in situations where we respond to a breach, where the CEO has shirked a responsibility of his or hers in developing a culture of cybersecurity because the priorities from the board otherwise were so onerous that that CEO didn't even get to the cybersecurity oversight that he or she is responsible for. What a sad story. So it starts at the board level, and it starts with a culture of cybersecurity.
That's really interesting because people often talk about, say, tone starts at the top and the leader sets the expectation. We probably think about the CEO and the C-suite, but in many ways the board should be not only modeling and setting the goals for the CEO and the rest of the C-suite to filter down. So it should start with the board. What you're saying makes a lot of sense. And many of these people are probably C-suite executives at other companies, right? So it works both ways. They do it here, they'll be able to take it there, and vice versa. So they should be setting the standard and then very clearly set what they expect for all the employees. And if we are setting standards for employees to follow, certainly the board members should be doing as well. It just feels like Caesar's wife should be beyond reproach, right? So these seem logical things that we should be doing. I'm glad you're casting light on it. It just seems, yeah, duh, I guess, right? So thank you.
Absolutely. And I'll add a very practical element to it, which is when you now look at every single board and then go down a level and say every single committee on the board, and then go down a level deeper and say every board director, and certainly especially the chairman, but also the head of the cyber committee or the head of the audit committee, head of HR committee, whichever committee on the board, that individual, every one of those levels now has very real, very specific, by group, by individual, and by the overall board, cybersecurity fiduciary responsibilities. And most boards do not realize that. So take, for example, something like the investment committee on a board. That has a very specific oversight and purview over M&A due diligence, right? How do we even look at targets? Are we, as a board, knowledgeable enough about how our company looks at M&A due diligence so that we are making sure that any third-party risk is managed appropriately? Well, that's a board fiduciary responsibility, right? Because if something goes awry, it goes back all the way to the board in case privacy regulations get trampled over, or in case privacy of whatever companies are merging become an issue and their customers suffer, and then government gets involved, and all of a sudden fines get imposed on the company because fiduciary responsibilities weren't discharged appropriately. And then the final big whammy, as I sometimes call it, which is now you even have imprisonment as a potential fine for board directors as part of the Bliley Act, as part of HIPAA. And yes, it's rare, and it needs to come out of proof that a particular individual board director acted negligently despite having knowledge of what should have been done from a cybersecurity perspective for a particular situation. But if that gets proven, then that board director is liable and potentially can go to jail for up to 5 years. So these issues are now very real. And if you look at the current session of Congress in the United States, the number of laws that have been introduced in just the 2022 Congress dwarfs the number of laws that any previous Congress has even thought about introducing, much less actually introducing. And so up until, I want to say, barely July of last year, so 2021, there were 18 laws that were introduced within just those first 7 months or so of the congressional session that had to do with cybersecurity and privacy. Many of them have to do with board oversight. And so if you're a chief legal officer in the company, or if you're the head of your audit committee or cyber committee, whoever is handling cybersecurity in your organization, and certainly if you're the CEO or the chairman, you have to pay attention to this.
And so, Andrzej, you've probably shocked all of us for a variety of reasons to thinking we need, as individuals and collectively as a board and organization, to do more and be better. And I know you've tried to codify this in a way that everyone can follow and understand, and you've got a book coming out within the next year. And I'd love if you'd tell us about that, sort of the 8 steps a board director and executive team should follow for how not to lose $9 million in a cyber breach. So if you didn't have our attention already, I think that headline grabs it pretty well too.
Yeah, because, unfortunately, the average price tag of a cyber breach in the United States right now is at $9 million. And that's actually nothing because, unfortunately, we still do not have a sense of what is the average price tag of a cyber breach. This $9 million is strictly based on the breaches that are disclosed and therefore breaches that we know. But companies still do not have enough incentive to disclose the fact that they've been breached. Now, regulations are catching up with that, and so we are learning more about it. But for the time being, even in the United States, we do not have enough breach disclosure to really, really know. And not every breach gets responded to, et cetera. So for the time being, we just know that from the breaches that have been reported, $9 million is the average financial price tag of a breach. Bear in mind that for everybody on the call, financial price tag of a breach generally gets dwarfed by the operational headaches that a company suffers in a breach, operational shutdown, etc. This $9 million does not account for the loss of future business, which is substantial, very often even more. And it doesn't account for any of the emotional and reputational damage that a company or an organization goes through in a breach. But nonetheless, it's $9 million. For the small and medium enterprise sector in the United States, the average price tag of a breach is $6.35 million. I think globally, the average price tag of a breach is $4 million or so, and that's only because the United States has a pretty cushy digital infrastructure that hackers can go after. So all that means for the rest of the globe is that as its digital infrastructure gets more prolific, that average price tag of a breach stands to potentially gain as well. So with that in mind, we simply said there's only one question that matters for our board. How do I not lose $9 million in a cyber breach and certainly also minimize the cost of the operational shutdown, emotional and reputational damage? And so we've looked at it from a 3 sort of pieces perspective, and then each of those pieces gets indeed broken out into 8 steps. The 3 pieces are not going to surprise anybody. The 8 steps will much more so. The first 3 pieces that you need to think about are, first, you've got to train your board and executive team up to snuff. In other words, everybody needs to be on the same page as far as what does a culture of cybersecurity actually mean? And it isn't the CISO. In fact, regulations are now no longer looking at the CISO or the CIO or the CTO as the linchpin very often, but instead they're looking at the CEO, at the executive suite, and as the board as the perpetrators of a breach, right? As the enablers of a breach. And so you really do need to bring everybody on your board and everybody on your executive team up to snuff on what is a culture of cybersecurity, how do we live it, how do we propagate it throughout the organization, and then how do we build a strategy that brings us forward. And so that brings me to the second piece of that sort of three-part wheel, which is you then have to stay on top of it and continue that education of your board and of your executive team, and certainly employees. But we focus on the board and the executive team because that culture really starts at the top, and unless those two groups, the board and the executive team, live that culture themselves, employees will not. Secondly, if you're looking at risks, executives and board directors are always exposed to the highest level of risk. And you know this from JP Morgan, right? When a typical executive travels, they're exposed to way more threats than an average employee might be, simply because of the role they play, the hackers that are after them. In fact, there are about 13, 15 different hacking groups that are specifically focused on the executive avatar, etc. And so you've got to stay on top of the changes. And one of those changes, for example, is the changing nature of cybersecurity fiduciary responsibilities for the board, for the executive team, for each group within that, so audit committee, etc., and then for each individual. Because those are changing as the hacker landscape, as the cybercrime industry change. So that's the second piece. Stay on top of it once you've gotten everybody on the same page. And then the third piece is simply make sure that you're surrounding yourself with proper outside experts. Because it doesn't matter whether you're a JP Morgan, an Amazon, or certainly a startup, you will not have enough resident knowledge to always stay on top of the hacker innovation landscape. And this is where I want to underscore, no one should care about regulation as being the ceiling of what the organization should be driving for in terms of cybersecurity compliance. Because while you may be ticking the boxes on regulations, the actual ceiling that you should be going after complying with is hacker innovation. And so unless you're staying ahead of hackers, it doesn't matter whether you're staying ahead of regulations. Your organization is still exposed. And so again, surrounding yourself with the right experts from the industry and from government is very important. And so then you ask yourself the question of, okay, let's say I follow step one, get everybody up to snuff, follow step two, we stay on top of it, follow step three, and indeed we surround ourselves with the right experts. What exactly does creating a culture of cybersecurity and creating a blueprint of cyber breach deterrence mean for our organization that actually would give us the chance of avoiding this $9 million average price of cyber breach, etc. And we look at it from first two perspectives: the self versus the organization, right? And so if you look at a typical board director, they have two duties that they need to fulfill. One is to be an authentic leader of cybersecurity themselves. And the second is to understand what the fiduciary responsibilities that they personally have as a director and execute on them. And so when you look at those two pieces, the self is then talked about in a number of ways, but I look at it from the perspective of what are my general risks, what are my sort of organizational VIP, if you will, specific risks that I specifically am exposed to because I'm the board director that faces a higher threat landscape than my average employee, right? So what are the general risks? What are the executive-specific risks that I face? And then what should my behavioral best practices be? And what should the technologies that I use and my best practices with those technologies be in order for me to indeed myself authentically lead a culture of cybersecurity myself? So that's the first way of looking at it. The second way of looking at it is, all right, so now let's say you understand you need to be looking at general risks, executive risks, behaviors, and technologies. Well, you've got to do it across a number of pieces of what we call your cyber avatar. And so that is your devices, right, from phones to laptops to apps to IoT devices, in your personal life, in your professional life, and in your family life, because now all three of those affect the organization's cyber insecurity, especially as we now work from home more. And so if you start with your devices, then you go through your cloud, and you go through your social media, and then passwords and authentication, and your travel. And for executives, travel, yes, during the pandemic was a lower sort of risk, if you will. But travel is a big one in cyber insecurity because we generally don't think about the cyber and digital risks as we travel. And yet, every single executive is exposed to breach potential, whether they are traveling across Wi-Fi networks in their own building. Okay, that's interesting, right? In other words, as you're moving from a cell tower to a Wi-Fi network to a cell tower, all those pieces of your journey have gaps. So you've got to pay attention to that. Second, if you're traveling to a friendly country, less friendly country, to a government building on foreign soil versus domestically, and God forbid you're going into a government building of an unfriendly country on your own soil, much less on foreign soil, all of those carry risks with it. As you're coming into an airport lounge or traveling through the airspace of a particular country, right? You have to now start thinking, what are my devices doing that is not healthy for the cybersecurity of my organization? You expose your organization with your travel patterns. And so whether you're using burners, no burners, etc., all of that starts becoming a question mark. And so part of what we lay out in the manuscript that we provide to the market is an actual funnel, if you will, of here's your self-focused cybersecurity and what it's composed of across both types of risks, types of behaviors, types of technologies, then juxtaposed against what exactly does that get made up of, from phones to, again, cloud, etc., travel, so on and so forth. And then, and only then, do we tackle the cybersecurity fiduciary responsibilities. And we get a lot of pushback sometimes on this because, executives say, well, why can't I just skip ahead to my cybersecurity fiduciary responsibilities? And the answer is fairly simple. Unless you've absolutely owned the behavioral and the technology cybersecurity of your own self, as a professional, as a private citizen, and as a family, you won't even fully grasp the issue that your cybersecurity fiduciary responsibilities expose you and your organization to. That's why the self is so important. So once you've sort of mastered the self and gotten everybody in your organization on the same page as far as what does self-focused, professional, personal, and family cybersecurity look like, and you therefore have a blueprint for every board director for self, every executive for self-focused cybersecurity, every employee for self-focused cybersecurity, again, as a professional, private citizen, and as a family, all of a sudden now you have a culture of, oh my God, now we understand what we bring to the table, what cybersecurity and what cyber insecurity, and how we should deal with that. Great. Now we can focus on our fiduciary duties. And those get composed of sort of four major areas. One is board strategy at a very high level, and we really go to town on what does board cybersecurity strategy consist of. Second one is regulatory policy. I'm sorry, before that even happens, geopolitics, right? Because as you, Alexander, mentioned at the beginning of this call, whether it's Ukraine and Russia and the world's response in cyberspace to this potential conflict or existent conflict, which can get exacerbated even further, you now have no excuse of not paying attention to how geopolitically your country's relationship with other countries affects your organization. It doesn't matter whether you're a healthcare company that absolutely is being breach attempted by other countries' breach-focused organizations or nation states themselves. You now have that geopolitical fiduciary responsibility. The second one is, or the third one is regulatory policy, which kind of emanates out of both consumer-focused privacy breaches as well as this geopolitical element, and therefore brings a lot of laws, regulations, standards, and frameworks that an organization, regardless of industry, needs to follow. And then the fourth piece is cyber insurance. And I always mention cyber insurance last because very often I hear, whether it's during speeches I give or board talks that I have on a daily basis, I always hear, well, if we get cyber insurance, then we're okay. The answer is no, for a number of reasons. One, cyber insurance will never cover the full extent of your financial loss, partly because it will never cover the full extent of your future business loss. Secondly, it will not cover the operational shutdown costs fully, if at all. Third, it will never cover the reputational damage. And fourth, it will absolutely never cover the emotional damage that all of your employees from the board down will go through. So those four pieces are very real. On top of which, the cyber insurance landscape is changing very rapidly because hackers are doing what they're doing. And so obviously even ransomware, which is a very simple example of cyber breaches, ransomware has become so prolific and so successful for hackers that now even AXA is starting to not cover ransomware as a covered insurance policy element. Well, that's a problem. Why do they not cover it? Because a lot of cyber insurance companies are now losing profitability and, in fact, going into the red by covering some of these things. And so the list of exclusions grows. And so if you're a board director and you're looking at your fiduciary responsibilities, you have to look ahead of that and say, okay, great, we're going to use cyber insurance as a tool, but a small piece of our overall strategy, not the end-all be-all. And then, again, as you're looking at staying on top of things on a consistent basis, there are three areas that you absolutely have to stay on top of, and that is, indeed, cyber security fiduciary responsibilities on an individual, team, and overall board/company level. First. Second, stay on top of your regulations, your industry standards, the changes in them, which lawmakers are coming out with what sort of laws so that you know where the wind is blowing and therefore can prepare your organization ahead of time rather than respond when it's too late. And then the third piece of staying up to date is, again, the cyber insurance piece, because the cyber insurance industry is changing on a daily and weekly basis. And then, when you go back to that wheel that we talked about of get everybody up to snuff and get everybody then continuously educated on the industry as it changes, then, again, the third piece is you've got to surround yourself with the right partners that will help you achieve all of this to begin with and then maintain you along the success curve. I know I've thrown a lot here.
Andrzej, I think you've blown some minds today, right? And I think everyone's going to be wanting to picking up a copy of this book when it comes out. And I think for a variety of reasons, my quick summary off the top of my head, if you have to take one away, everyone who's a board member is one, I guess, top of the front of the newspaper front page away from being a public official. If that doesn't give you a cause for concern, everything else you covered today does as well. Andrzej, we were delighted to have you on the show today. Thank you for sharing your deep insights into all of this cyber stuff and helping us to be boardroom bound.
What a pleasure, Alexander.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Andrzej Cetnarski, clearly a cybersecurity expert, and the strategic approach that he's bringing to all of us, helping us understand that we need to do better, we must do better, and we can do better. He really laid that out in a very succinct way, and clearly I think most of us are going to need to read his book. And remember, if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you will get links to all of today's resources. And please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.